My wife, Eleanor, was the perfect wife for an FBI agent. Loyal, predictable, the bedrock of my world, which was built on facts. After she died, I found her diaries, hidden in a secret compartment. I began to read, expecting to find memories of our perfect life. But the very first page told me the truth about the son I had despised and thrown out of the house. And that truth turned my 40 years of service to the truth into one complete lie. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Edward Corrigan. For 35 years, I was a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My life was, and is, governed by procedure, by the calm, relentless application of order to a world of chaos. At 79 years old, a widower, that discipline is all I have left. My world is this house, a quiet colonial in a Virginia suburb, a place where every object rests in its designated location, where the silence is broken only by the predictable ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. It has been 6 months since my wife, Eleanor, passed. The grief is a managed thing, a file I keep in a locked drawer of my mind to be reviewed only at designated intervals. Today, the designated task was to bring order to the last bastion of her life, her closet. The day began, as all my days do, at 600 hours. The coffee was black, brewed in a meticulously cleaned percolator. The morning newspaper was read, its sections refolded along their original creases. By 0900, my operation was ready to commence. I placed 3 large, empty cardboard boxes in the center of our master bedroom, each with a specific purpose. I used a thick black marker to label them with a steady, practiced hand. Goodwill. Keepsakes. Trash. The task was unpleasant, an emotional minefield, but I approached it as I would any professional assignment, with detachment and a clear objective. To process, to categorize, to file away the physical remnants of a 45-year partnership. I opened the doors to her walk-in closet. The air inside was still, holding the faint, ghostly scent of her perfume, a scent I had known for most of my adult life. It was a clean, simple fragrance, like the woman herself. Her clothes were arranged with a precision that had always mirrored my own. Blouses were grouped by color, from white to dark. Skirts and slacks hung on identical wooden hangers. It was the wardrobe of the perfect agent's wife, sensible, elegant, and entirely appropriate. There were no loud patterns, no frivolous designs. Eleanor understood the importance of appearances, the need for a stable, respectable home front for a man in my line of work. I began with the blouses. I took them down, one by one, the soft silk and cotton cool against my hands. I remembered her in each of them. This blue one, worn to the director's Christmas party in '98. This white one, worn to our son, Michael's high school graduation. That was a difficult memory. The boy's sullen face a stark contrast to his mother's proud, determined smile. I folded each garment into a perfect, flat square, the way I had been taught to pack a suitcase at Quantico. Most went into the Goodwill box. They were just objects, their purpose now concluded. I moved on to her shoes, a neat row of low heels and walking shoes on a wooden rack. Practical, sensible footwear. I ran my hand over a pair of simple black pumps she had worn to countless bureau functions. She had been the perfect partner, a silent, supportive presence at my side, navigating the complex social world of the agency with a grace I could never muster. She understood the mission, the importance of discretion, the necessity of a life lived within the clear, established lines of duty and honor, or so I had always believed. In the back of the closet was a small locked chest. It was her jewelry box. I had the key on my own keychain, a tiny, ornate thing she had given me for safekeeping years ago. Inside, there was no ostentation. A simple string of pearls for our 25th anniversary. a pair of small diamond earrings for her 50th birthday, a thin gold locket. I opened it. Inside were two tiny, faded photographs, one of a younger me, stiff and serious in my academy uniform, and the other of Michael as a small, happy child, before the anger and the resentment had taken root, before he had turned his back on everything I stood for. I closed the locket and placed the entire chest in the keepsakes box. The work was slow, methodical. It took hours. I found a box of old photo albums, and I allowed myself a brief, scheduled moment to review them. The pictures told the story I had always known. Our wedding day. The day we brought Michael home from the hospital. Family vacations to national parks. All of us smiling for the camera. The narrative was clean, consistent, a perfect, unbroken record of a successful American life. There were no anomalies, no pieces of evidence that did not fit the established file. The story was solid. By late afternoon, the closet was nearly empty. All that remained was a stack of hat boxes on the top shelf. I pulled them down. Most contained hats, as expected, carefully wrapped in tissue paper. But the last one, at the very bottom, felt different. It was heavier. I lifted the lid. It was not filled with hats. It was filled with old, leather-bound diaries, tied together in bundles with faded silk ribbons. I stared at them. A flicker of something. Surprise, curiosity, breaching my carefully constructed detachment. Eleanor had never been one for writing, I thought. She was a woman of quiet action, not of introspection. I had never seen these before. They were a new piece of evidence, an addendum to a case I had long considered closed. I took one of the bundles, untied the ribbon, and looked at the first volume. The date on the cover was 1968. A year before I met her. I sat down on the edge of our bed, the empty, ordered closet before me, and I opened the book, still believing it would contain nothing more than the innocent, girlish thoughts of the woman I would one day marry. The room was quiet. The world was in order. And I was, for the last time in my life, completely and utterly certain of the truth. I sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping under my weight. The bedroom was quiet, the afternoon sun casting long, gentle shadows across the floor. The task was done. The boxes were sealed. The closet was an empty, orderly space. I had processed the physical remnants of my wife's life, categorizing 45 years of partnership into neat, manageable stacks. All that remained was this final, unexpected discovery, the stack of old, leather-bound diaries. I held the first volume in my hands. The leather was soft and worn, the corners rounded with time. The year 1968 was embossed in faded gold leaf on the cover, a year before we met. I felt a sense of calm curiosity, the feeling of an historian about to read a primary source document that would add a final, clarifying chapter to a story whose ending he already knew. I believed I was about to read the prologue to our life together. I opened the book. The pages were yellowed, brittle at the edges, and filled with my wife's elegant, familiar handwriting. The penmanship was the same one that had written our grocery lists, that had signed 45 years of birthday cards to me, a script as known and as comforting as her own voice. But the words were not her voice. They were the words of a stranger. The first entry was dated from Berkeley. The location itself was a small, dissonant note, a place I associated with chaos, with the very social decay I had dedicated my life to combating. She had never mentioned spending any significant time there. I began to read. The words on the page did not describe the quiet, sensible young woman I thought I knew. They were a testament to a person I had never met, a woman of fierce, fiery passion. She wrote not of classes or social events, but of protests, of marches, of a fervent, all-consuming belief in a cause. She wrote of the energy of the crowd, the power of 1,000 voices rising in unison against a system I had sworn an oath to protect. Her prose was vivid, alive, full of a poetry and a rage that I, her husband of nearly half a century, had never known she possessed. A deep, unsettling feeling began to coil in my gut. This was not a prologue. This was a different book entirely. Then she wrote about him. He was not named at first, referred to only as R, the charismatic leader of the student movement she had joined. She described him not as a boyfriend, but as a force of nature. She wrote of the power of his convictions, the fire in his eyes when he spoke of changing the world, of his kindness and his courage. Every word of praise for this man, this nameless radical, was a quiet indictment of the orderly, predictable life she had later chosen with me. I felt a cold, unfamiliar jealousy, a resentment towards a ghost from a past I had never known existed. I read on, my breath catching in my chest, a terrible premonition taking root in my mind. And then I came to the entry that broke the world. It was dated a few months after the first. Her writing was more urgent, the loops of the letters tighter, the sentences shorter, more breathless. She wrote of a night with him, a night of consequence. And then, the words that stopped my heart, the words that rendered everything I had ever known into a lie. She wrote of the new life taking root inside of her. A child, his child. She wrote of her fear, but also of a fierce, protective joy. She wrote of her hope that this child, their child, would grow up to carry his father's spirit, his passion for justice, his unwillingness to bend to a world he knew was broken. And at the end of the entry, in a clear, unwavering hand, she had written the name they had chosen for him. Michael. The diary slipped from my numb fingers and fell to the floor with a soft, muffled thud. The room was perfectly silent, but in my mind, a symphony of shattering glass was roaring. It was not possible. My mind, the trained, analytical mind of an investigator, rejected the evidence. It was a story, a fantasy, a piece of youthful romantic fiction. Michael was my son. I was there. I was there at the hospital. I had held him in my arms. My name was on his birth certificate. These were the facts. The file was closed. But the diary lay open on the floor, its silent testimony a direct contradiction to the entire official record of my life. My training took over. I picked up the book. I examined it not as a grieving husband, but as an agent examining a piece of evidence. I ran my fingers over the paper, assessing its age, its texture. I studied the ink, the way it had faded, the way it had bled slightly into the porous old paper. I analyzed the handwriting, the specific unique pressure points and flourishes of Eleanor's script. Every instinct, every ounce of my 35 years of experience in discerning truth from fiction screamed at me that the document was authentic, the evidence was irrefutable, and the conclusion was impossible. The denial shattered, and in its place, a horrifying, comprehensive understanding flooded in, a tide of black water that recontextualized and corrupted every memory I held dear. The past 45 years replayed in my mind, but now as a grotesque, tragic farce. I saw myself in the hospital, holding a baby that was not mine, beaming with the pride of a fool. I saw myself teaching a young Michael how to throw a baseball, the son of another man, a radical, a man I would have considered an enemy of the state. I saw all our arguments, the terrible, bitter fights with a teenage Michael over his politics, his lifestyle, his refusal to follow my path. I had seen it as a rebellion against me, against my values. I understood now that it was never a rebellion. It was an inheritance. He was not rebelling against me. He was being true to a father he had never known. And my final, terrible act, the day I had disowned him, the day I had thrown him out of my house for betraying my name, now seemed like the cruelest irony of all. I had punished him for not being my son, when in fact, he never was. I sat there on the edge of the bed as the sun began to set. the soft afternoon light giving way to the long, cold shadows of evening. The bedroom grew dark around me. I did not move to turn on a lamp. I simply sat in the encroaching darkness, the open diary a pale square on the floor in front of me. The perfect, orderly house, the fortress of my certainties, had become the scene of a crime, and I was the only victim. I had been betrayed, not by a single illicit act, but by the entire 45-year architecture of my life. The calm day was over. The truth was out, and I was a stranger, sitting in the ruins of a life I had never truly lived. The darkness of the bedroom was absolute, a physical presence that mirrored the new, vast emptiness inside me. I did not move for hours. I remained on the edge of the bed, a statue carved from shock, as the last vestiges of daylight bled from the sky and the house settled into its deep, nightly silence. The open diary lay on the floor, a pale, accusing square in the gloom. The world I had inhabited just that afternoon, a world of solid facts, of a well-remembered past, of a love I believed to be as true and as foundational as the earth itself, had been revealed as a fiction, a meticulously crafted stage play in which I had been the unknowing lead actor. Every memory I possessed was now suspect, tainted by the secret the diary held. The woman I had mourned for 6 months was not the woman I had been married to, and the son I had disowned was not my son. Grief is a chaotic, disorderly thing. It defies logic and procedure. But the thing I felt in the long, silent hours of that night was something else entirely. It was a cold, structural collapse. The load-bearing walls of my identity had been dynamited, and I was standing in the ruins. There was grief, yes, a profound and bottomless sorrow for the life I thought I had. But underneath it, something else was beginning to stir. It was a cold, familiar instinct, an old professional reflex. When a crime has been committed, when the facts are in dispute, when the truth has been deliberately obscured, you do not despair. You investigate. As the first thin gray light of dawn began to seep through the window blinds, I stood up. My body was stiff, my movement slow, but my mind was clear with a new and terrible purpose. The part of me that was a husband was dead, but the agent was reawakening. I walked out of the bedroom, leaving the diary on the floor, and went downstairs to my study. This room had been a monument to my past, a curated exhibition of my career. The walls were lined with framed commendations from the bureau, a photograph of me shaking the hand of a director, a glass case containing the service revolver I had carried for 35 years. But I did not look at them now. They were artifacts from a life that belonged to someone else. I sat down at my large mahogany desk. The surface was clean, orderly, my pens aligned in a neat row. I switched on the green-shaded desk lamp, its focused pool of light pushing back the dawn. For 45 years, my life had been a lie. A deception had been perpetrated. The objective, therefore, was not revenge. Revenge on a ghost is a fool's errand. The objective was the truth. I would conduct one last investigation. I would declassify my own life. I would uncover the full scope of the conspiracy that had been my marriage. This was the birth of the plan. It was not a plan for vengeance, but for a final, brutal accounting. My first step was to establish a case file. I took out a new, clean manila folder and, with my old fountain pen, wrote a title on the tab, Eleanor Corrigan. A second file, Michael Corrigan. I opened the first file. The known facts were simple. The evidence was the stack of diaries, currently upstairs. The objective was to understand the co-conspirator, the unnamed man who was my son's biological father, and to map the entire secret history my wife had lived alongside me. I went back upstairs and retrieved the diaries. I handled them now with a new sense of detachment, as if they were evidence collected from a scene. I placed them on my desk, a stack of lies waiting to be interrogated. I began to read, but not as a husband. I read as an analyst. I had a legal pad at my side, and I started a timeline. Berkeley, 1968. I noted the names of the activist groups she mentioned, the locations of the protests, every small verifiable detail. I was no longer reading a love story. I was dissecting a field report from an enemy agent. The emotional content was irrelevant. I was hunting for facts, for leads, for loose threads I could pull. My second objective was more immediate. I needed to find Michael. He was the living embodiment of the secret, the one piece of tangible evidence I could question. He was no longer just the cause of my greatest disappointment. He was now my primary person of interest. I turned to my computer. It had been years since I had used the old skills in earnest, but the protocols were ingrained in me. I began a systematic search. I used public records databases, archived news reports of the protests he had been involved in, old social media footprints. The man I had dismissed as a drifting, aimless failure had, in fact, been very busy, his life a long series of commitments to causes I had deemed subversive. I found traces of him in Oregon, in Colorado, in Northern California. He was a ghost, moving between environmental communes and protest camps, living a life entirely off the grid I had spent my career defending. Finding him through conventional means would be difficult and slow. I needed a more direct approach. I opened a locked drawer in my desk and pulled out a small leather-bound address book. It was a relic from my bureau days, filled with the names and numbers of the men I had worked with, the men I had trusted with my life. Most were retired now. Some were dead. But one name stood out. A man who had left the bureau to start a very successful, very discreet private security and investigations firm. A man who owed me a significant favor. I picked up the phone. My hand was perfectly steady. The call was brief and to the point. I did not explain the circumstances. I simply stated that I needed to find my son. I gave him Michael's name, date of birth, and the last known locations my own research had uncovered. I requested a full workup, current location, associates, activities. I told him it was a matter of the utmost urgency and personal importance. He asked no questions. He simply agreed. The hunt had begun. I hung up the phone, the plan now officially in motion. The grief was still there, a cold, heavy weight in my chest, but it was now contained, compartmentalized, transformed into the fuel for the mission. The betrayed husband was gone. The special agent was back on the case. The call to my former colleague was a single, decisive action. A stone dropped into a deep well. Now there was nothing to do but wait for the ripples to return, and waiting was not a skill I had ever cultivated with any grace. An idle mind is a dangerous place, and mine was a landscape of fresh ruins and unanswered questions. To fend off the paralysis of reflection, I turned to the only other avenue of my investigation, the stack of leather-bound diaries on my desk. They were the last will and testament of a woman I had never known. If my life had become a cold case, these journals were the complete, unredacted file of the primary subject. I would not allow myself to read them as a husband searching for answers. I would read them as an agent searching for leads. I cleared my desk, leaving only a lamp, the first diary, and a fresh legal pad. I spent the first few hours creating a system. I bought a set of colored adhesive tabs, each color assigned to a specific category of information. Red for names of associates, blue for locations, yellow for dates of significant events, green for any mention of financial transactions. I would not read for narrative. I would dissect and catalog the text, cross-referencing every entry, building a relational database of my wife's secret life. It was a sterile, procedural approach to a matter of profound heartbreak, and it was the only thing keeping me sane. I began with the first diary, dated 1968. The passionate, idealistic words of the young Eleanor were a constant, low-grade hum of dissonance. a stranger's voice speaking from a familiar page. I ignored the emotional content and focused on the data. Names appeared, mostly first names of fellow student activists: Mark, Judy, David, a man named Julian who seemed to be the charismatic leader she called R. Locations were mentioned: Sproul Plaza, Telegraph Avenue, a specific coffee shop that had served as an informal headquarters. I worked for days. A man possessed. My house, once a sanctuary of quiet retirement, was now a functional intelligence post. The dining room table was covered in maps of Berkeley from the late 1960s, on which I marked the locations Eleanor mentioned. My computer hummed day and night as I cross-referenced the names from the diary with archived university records and news articles about the protests of that era. Most were dead ends, common names that led nowhere. The ghost of her past was well defended, its secrets protected by the passage of half a century. But in the third volume, dated 1970, after Michael's birth, after the charismatic R had been imprisoned, a new pattern emerged. Eleanor wrote of her fear and isolation, but also of a continued, clandestine connection to her old life. She wrote of sending small packages and letters, not to any individual, but to a post office box in a small town in upstate New York. And she mentioned the name of the person who had arranged it, a trusted friend from the movement who had also gone underground. It was a woman's name, Sarah. This was the first concrete, verifiable lead, the first pawn, a name and a potential location. My focus shifted entirely. The broader narrative of the diaries was set aside. The search for Sarah became the primary objective. I took to my computer, my old skills in tracking and locating individuals slowly coming back to me. Posing as a genealogist, I accessed public records databases, searching for women named Sarah, who would have been in their early 20s in Berkeley in the late 1960s, and who later had connections to New York. The initial search returned hundreds of hits, a haystack of needles. But I had another piece of data. Eleanor, in one entry, had mentioned that Sarah was a student of art history. I narrowed the search. The list shrank. I spent an entire night sifting through digital archives of university yearbooks, my eyes straining at the grainy black and white photographs of hopeful young faces. And then I found her. A photograph of a serious-looking young woman with long dark hair, identified as Sarah Jenkins. The name was a key. I began a new targeted search for Sarah Jenkins. I traced her digital and paper trail through the decades. A marriage certificate from 1975, a change of name, a series of addresses that moved from New York to a quiet, rural corner of Vermont, a property deed from 20 years ago. I found her. She was no longer a young radical, but a woman in her late 70s, a widow, living a quiet life as a potter in a small, isolated town. She was the first living link to my wife's secret, the keeper of a history I was now certain she had helped conceal. The investigator in me knew what came next. You do not approach a target of this importance without a pretext. To arrive as Ed Corrigan, retired FBI agent and the husband of her old friend, would be to send her running, her defenses raised. I needed a cover. I spent another day constructing one. I created a fictional identity, a retired university professor, an historian working on a book about the domestic protest movements of the Vietnam War era. I fabricated credentials, a university affiliation, a plausible line of inquiry. My request would be for an interview, a simple conversation with someone who was there, to add a personal perspective to my academic research. It was a clean, professional approach that would, I hoped, bypass her suspicions. My preparations were meticulous. I booked a flight to Burlington, a rental car, a room in a quiet bed and breakfast a town over from my target's location. I packed a single small suitcase. The contents were sparse: a few changes of clothes, a notebook, a digital recorder, and a file containing my carefully rehearsed questions. The act of packing, of preparing for a field operation, was a deeply familiar one. It felt more natural than anything I had done in the past 6 months of my grief-stricken retirement. The mission had a clear objective. I had a target, and I had a plan of approach. The next morning, as the plane climbed through the clouds, leaving the familiar landscape of my life behind, I looked out the window. I felt no fear, no sadness, only the cold, quiet focus of an agent in motion. The passive phase of my investigation was over. I was on my way to engage my first pawn. The hotel room in Vermont was sterile and anonymous, a place utterly devoid of history. It was the perfect blank slate from which to conduct my approach. I had spent the day preparing, driving the route to the small, secluded town where Sarah Jenkins lived, observing her small pottery studio from a distance, and rehearsing the details of my cover story. My mission was clear. My pretext was solid. But as evening fell and the silence of the hotel room closed in around me, I felt a familiar, gnawing uncertainty. I was about to interview a key figure from my wife's secret past, yet I still did not truly understand the world she had inhabited. To question a witness effectively, an agent must first understand their context, their motivations, their language. I knew nothing of Eleanor's. I opened my briefcase and took out the second volume of her diaries. I had to go back in, not for leads this time, but for atmosphere, for understanding. I had to see the world through her eyes. I sat in the uncomfortable corporate armchair under the weak glow of a reading lamp and opened the book. The date at the top of the first page was April 1968. I began to read, and the bland beige walls of the hotel room dissolved, replaced by the vibrant, chaotic, and terrifying world of my wife's hidden youth. Through her words, I saw Berkeley. I did not see it as I had known it from the Bureau's field reports, a hotbed of sedition, a cancer of anti-American sentiment. I saw it through her eyes, as a place of exhilarating, terrifying possibility. She wrote of the air itself, how it seemed to crackle with energy, with the scent of jasmine, exhaust fumes, and the occasional acrid tang of tear gas. She wrote of the sound, a constant low-frequency hum of guitars from Sproul Plaza, of passionate arguments in coffee shops, of the rhythmic chanting pulse of 100 marches. She, the quiet, reserved woman I had married, described herself as a person waking from a long suburban slumber, her senses coming alive for the very first time. And then I saw him, the man she called R. He entered the narrative not as a person, but as an event. She described the first time she heard him speak, not in a lecture hall, but standing on an overturned crate in the middle of a crowded plaza. I saw him as she painted him, not a long-haired, drug-addled malcontent from a bureau file, but a figure of intense, almost painful, intellectual fire. She wrote of his voice, how it cut through the noise of the crowd, not with anger, but with a kind of searing, logical passion. He spoke of systemic injustice, of a war built on lies, of a moral imperative to not be a silent accomplice to the crimes of the state. He was articulating every vague, unformed feeling of dissatisfaction she had felt with the quiet, orderly world she had been raised in. He was giving her a language for her own rebellion. I read of their first meeting in the crowded, smoke-filled back room of a radical bookstore. I saw her, a shy, serious girl, and him, the charismatic leader, turning his full, undivided attention to her. He did not flirt with her. He challenged her. He asked her what she believed, what she was prepared to do about it. He gave her books to read, books I had only ever seen listed in bureau files on subversive literature. He dismantled her world, argument by argument, and then helped her build a new one based on a completely different set of blueprints. The betrayal I felt was no longer the simple hot jealousy of a cuckolded husband. It was something colder, more profound. It was the intellectual betrayal of discovering that the woman whose mind I thought I knew had been shaped and molded by a philosophy I considered to be a poison. Through the pages of her diary, I became a silent, unwilling witness to their affair. It was an affair of the mind as much as the body. I saw them in the late-night press room of an underground newspaper, the air thick with the smell of ink and coffee, their heads bent together as they argued over the wording of a leaflet. I saw them at a sit-in, in the main hall of the university administration building, a line of defiant, vulnerable students against a wall of armed police. She wrote of the fear, but also of the profound sense of solidarity, of belonging to something larger than herself. She described looking at R in that moment, seeing his calm, resolute face, and feeling not just love, but a deep and abiding admiration. She had not been his follower. She had been his partner. The climax of the diary, and of my own vicarious journey into her past, was her description of the Big May protest. I read, and I saw the scene unfold with the terrible clarity of a nightmare. The sunny afternoon, the festive, almost carnival-like atmosphere of the initial gathering, the banners, the songs, the feeling of hope. Then, the shift, the arrival of the police in full riot gear, the escalating tension, the first thrown rock, the explosion of chaos. Her writing became frantic, the elegant script devolving into a rushed, jagged scrawl. She wrote of the screaming, the choking clouds of tear gas, the sight of her friends being beaten and dragged away. And through it all, she wrote of him. He was not throwing rocks. He was on the front lines, trying to help the injured, trying to pull people to safety. His voice a steady, calming presence in the storm of violence. He was being a leader. He was being a hero. He was being everything I had spent my life believing his kind were not. I closed the diary, my hand trembling. The beige hotel room slowly swam back into focus. The silence was absolute. The woman I was going to interview tomorrow, Sarah Jenkins, had been a part of this world. She had stood beside Eleanor in that chaos. She had believed in the same things, perhaps loved the same man. I had come here as an investigator, an outsider on a mission to extract a piece of information from a hostile source. But I understood now that I was not just investigating a secret. I was confronting a ghost. The ghost of the passionate, courageous, radical young woman my wife had been. A woman I had never known. A woman who had, for 45 years, lived a quiet, secret life of exile inside the perfect, orderly world I had built for her. The cause of the betrayal was clear. It was not another man. It was another world. And I was the enemy. The town in Vermont was a world away from the manicured lawns and political certainty of my life in Virginia. It was a place of old farmhouses, winding dirt roads, and a quiet, stubborn sense of independence. It was, I realized, the perfect place for a person to disappear, to live out a life according to their own rules, far from the judgment of the world. Sarah Jenkins' pottery studio was at the end of one such road, a converted barn that smelled of wood smoke, wet clay, and something else, a kind of deep, earthy peace that felt both foreign and vaguely threatening. I parked my rental car and walked to the door, my historian's notebook in hand, my mind a cold, clear chamber of carefully rehearsed questions. I was here to divide the past, to cleave the life of the woman I knew from the life of the woman she was, and conquer the lie that had defined my own. She was waiting for me. Sarah was a woman in her late 70s, with kind, intelligent eyes that seemed to hold a deep, abiding sadness. Her hands, covered in a fine gray dust of dried clay, were gnarled with arthritis, but moved with a practiced, gentle grace. She was not the fiery radical I had imagined, but a woman who, like the clay she worked, had been shaped and softened by time and pressure. She led me into the main room of the studio, a vast, light-filled space with shelves reaching to the high rafters, all of them filled with beautiful, organically shaped pottery in shades of blue and green and earth. She offered me a seat and a mug of herbal tea. I maintained my cover, the slightly stooped academic historian researching a forgotten chapter of the 1960s. I began my questions, my voice a calm, neutral instrument of inquiry, my every professional instinct focused on building rapport, on opening the door to the past she kept locked away. I started with the general, asking her about the atmosphere in Berkeley in those years, about the ideals and the energy of the movement. She spoke, her voice quiet and reflective, of a time of immense hope and profound disillusionment. She spoke of her friends, a tight-knit group of students who genuinely believed they could stop a war and build a more just society. And as she spoke, she began to talk about Eleanor. She described my wife with a fondness that was a fresh wound in my own heart. She spoke of Eleanor's quiet intelligence, her fierce, unyielding moral compass, her bravery. She was describing a woman I recognized, but in a context that was utterly alien. The qualities I had interpreted as wifely devotion and quiet conservatism, Sarah was describing as the core tenets of a radical activist. I gently steered the conversation, guiding her towards the man, the leader, the ghost who stood at the center of this entire mystery. I asked about the leadership of the student groups, about the men and women who had inspired them. Her expression softened. She spoke of him. His name was Julian. She described him as I had read in Eleanor's diary, a brilliant, passionate, and deeply gentle man. She spoke of his and Eleanor's connection not as a youthful fling, but as a profound meeting of souls, a partnership of ideals. She described their shared dream, a dream of a world without war, a world they were trying to build together. My teacup grew cold in my hands as I listened, a silent, invisible judge hearing the testimony that was systematically dismantling the entire case of my own life. Then I asked what had happened to him. Sarah's gaze drifted to the window, to the green hills of Vermont. She told me the story the diaries had only hinted at. Julian had been arrested during the May protest, the one Eleanor had described with such terror. He had been a leader, and the authorities had decided to make an example of him. He was charged with inciting a riot, a charge that was a complete fabrication. He had been a voice of nonviolence, she insisted, a man who had tried to de-escalate the chaos, not create it. But he was convicted on perjured testimony and sentenced to a long, brutal prison term. He had, in essence, been politically assassinated. The enemy of the state I had imagined him to be was, in her telling, a victim of the very system I had sworn to uphold. The final, most difficult part of the inquiry was at hand. I had to ask about the child. I framed the question carefully, as a historian interested in the personal costs of activism. I asked if there were families, children, left behind in the wreckage of that time. Sarah was silent for a long moment, studying my face, her gaze suddenly sharp, analytical. I held her gaze, my own face a carefully neutral mask. Finally, she gave a slow, sad nod. She told me that Eleanor had been pregnant when Julian was sent away. She told me of Eleanor's despair, her fear for the future of her child, a child who would be born with a father, branded a felon, a traitor. And then she delivered the blow that shattered the last of my defenses. She explained how she, Sarah, had been the go-between, the linchpin in a conspiracy of silence that had lasted for nearly 50 years. She had managed the post office box. She had been the one to receive the small, regular packages of cash from Eleanor, money she now knew was meant to support Michael's own activist work, a quiet continuation of his father's legacy. She had been the one to ensure that the two worlds, Eleanor's quiet, respectable life in Virginia and her son's radical, transient existence, never, ever collided. I sat there, in that quiet, sunlit pottery studio, a fraud in a borrowed suit of clothes, and I understood everything. The lie was not a simple, single act of infidelity. It was a complex, brilliantly executed, lifelong clandestine operation. Eleanor had lived her entire adult life as a deep cover agent in my home, protecting the memory of her fallen hero and secretly funding the insurgency of his son. The woman I had married, the life I had lived, were both elaborate constructions, a cover story of breathtaking scope and duration. I finished my interview, my notebook now filled with the cold, hard facts of my own irrelevance. Sarah, as a parting gift, gave me a small, beautifully glazed blue bowl. It was a peace offering from a world I did not belong to. I held it in my hands. It was a perfect, beautiful lie. I drove away from the studio, from the quiet Vermont town, my mission a complete and devastating success. I had divided the enemy. I had conquered the lie. And now I was alone, in the quiet, echoing ruins of the truth. The long flight back from Vermont was a study in controlled turbulence, both inside the aircraft and within my own mind. The interview with Sarah Jenkins had been a tactical success. I had acquired the name of my son's biological father and confirmed the mechanics of my wife's lifelong deception. I had conquered the lie, but the truth was a desolate, alien landscape. I now possessed a series of hard, cold facts, but I had no context for them, no understanding of the world from which they had sprung. The diaries and Sarah's testimony spoke of a time and a philosophy so completely antithetical to my own that it felt like a report from another planet. My FBI training had taught me how to investigate subversives, not how to understand them. I was an expert in the what, but I was a complete novice in the why. And without the why, the truth was just a collection of meaningless, painful data. Back in my study, the investigation stalled. I had the name Julian, but he was a ghost, likely dead or lost to the prison system decades ago. I had the confirmation of Michael's parentage, but I did not yet have his location. And I had the diaries, the voice of my dead wife speaking a language of rebellion and passion I could not decipher. I realized then that my own skills were insufficient for this new phase of the mission. My old contacts in the Bureau would be useless. They would only see the world through the same narrow, hostile lens as I did. I needed a different kind of expert. I needed a guide, an interpreter who could lead me through the foreign country of my wife's past. My approach was, as always, methodical. I spent 2 days at the library, not researching individuals, but academic historians, sociologists, and authors who had made the protest movements of the 1960s their life's work. I was looking for a specific kind of scholar, someone respected, objective, and deeply immersed in the primary sources of the era. One name appeared again and again in my search, cited in articles and praised in book reviews. A Dr. Eris Thorne, a professor of modern American history at a university in the city. Her specialty was the very movement that had shaped my wife's secret life. I crafted a new email, an inquiry from my persona as the retired historian. I explained that my research had led me to some very personal, very powerful primary source documents, a woman's diaries from the heart of the Berkeley movement, and that I was struggling to understand their context. I requested a professional consultation, for which I was more than willing to pay her standard fee. She replied within a day, her email brief and professional, agreeing to a meeting in her office at the university. Her office was a complete and total inversion of my own study. Where my room was a place of stark, rigid order, hers was a space of chaotic, vibrant intellectualism. Books were not just on the shelves, they were stacked on the floor, on the desk, on every available surface. The walls were covered not with framed commendations, but with faded concert posters, political cartoons from the era, and black and white photographs of protests. The air smelled of old paper, dust, and brewed coffee. It was a room that was lived in, a room where ideas were wrestled with, not filed away. Dr. Thorne herself was a woman in her 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She was not the aging radical I had half expected, but a focused, energetic scholar who radiated a deep, unsentimental passion for her subject. I began by laying out my carefully constructed cover story, the tale of the historian who had stumbled upon a remarkable personal record. I spoke of my subject, the anonymous diarist, and my struggle to understand her motivations. Dr. Thorne listened patiently, her gaze never leaving my face. I asked my prepared questions designed to fit the chaos of that time into the neat, manageable boxes of an FBI report. I asked about the organizational structure of the student groups, their funding sources, their connections to known subversive organizations. She answered my questions, but not in the way I expected. She dismantled my categories, my entire framework of understanding. She spoke not of organizations, but of ideas. She explained the philosophical underpinnings of the movement, the deep moral outrage against the war, the passionate belief in civil disobedience. She brought out old, archived newspapers and showed me the articles, not about riots, but about poetry readings and peaceful sit-ins. She played me a scratchy recording of a folk singer from that time, and in the simple, heartfelt lyrics, I heard not a call to anarchy, but a profound plea for peace. She was giving me the context, the atmosphere, the very soul of the time that my own field reports had so clinically stripped away. Taking a calculated risk, I showed her a transcript of a single page from Eleanor's diary, with the names and dates removed. I presented it as a document from my anonymous source. She read it, her expression shifting from academic interest to one of deep, empathetic engagement. She recognized the event Eleanor was describing, the May protest that had turned violent. But she saw it from the other side. She explained how that day was a turning point, the moment the state had responded to idealism with brute force, radicalizing a generation of students who had, until then, believed in the possibility of peaceful change. She looked up from the page, and her sharp, analytical eyes seemed to see straight through my carefully constructed facade. She saw not just a historian, but a man profoundly and personally lost in the history he claimed to be studying. In that moment, the nature of our meeting changed. She leaned forward, her demeanor shifting from that of a lecturer to that of a guide. She began to ask me questions, not about my research, but about my understanding, gently probing the edges of my rigid worldview, challenging my assumptions. She did not mock my perspective. She simply offered another one, a perspective in which the heroes and villains were not so clearly defined. And then she made her offer. She offered me access to the university's archives, a vast collection of oral histories, of interviews with the men and women who had been there. She offered to guide me through them, to help me understand the language, the symbols, the heart of the world that had produced the woman who had written that diary. I left the university that afternoon as the sun was setting. My notebook was filled not with investigative leads, but with a list of books to read, of films to watch, of archival records to review. Dr. Thorne had not offered to help me find a man. She had offered to help me understand a ghost. I was no longer just an agent on a mission to uncover a lie. I was now a student, reluctantly embarking on an education in the very ideals I had spent my life opposing. I was more uncertain than I had ever been, the neat, black and white lines of my world now blurred into 1,000 shades of gray. I had gone seeking an asset for my investigation. I had found, instead, an unexpected and unsettling ally for my soul. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning. It was a simple encrypted message from the secure server of the investigations firm my old colleague ran. It contained no text, only a single password-protected file. I typed in the alphanumeric code we had established 30 years ago, a code I had never expected to use again. A satellite image appeared on my screen, a green pixelated expanse of forest in the coastal range of Oregon. A small red circle was drawn around a clearing, barely visible through the dense canopy of ancient fir trees. Below it were a set of geographical coordinates and a single typed sentence. Subject is believed to be a permanent resident at this location. The hunt was over. I had found him. The abstract concept of my son, the person of interest in my investigation, now had a physical, verifiable place in the world. The journey west was a journey into enemy territory. I flew into Portland, the city a sprawling, unfamiliar map below me. I rented a bland gray sedan, a car that would attract no attention, and began the long drive towards the coast. The neat, orderly suburbs of the city quickly gave way to winding two-lane roads that cut through dense, dark forests. The air grew cooler, smelling of rain and damp earth. This was a different America, a place wilder and less tamed than the manicured lawns and historical certainties of my life in Virginia. This was the kind of place people came to escape, to live by their own rules. It was the natural habitat for a man like my son, a man who had made a life out of rejecting the world I had built. I felt a grim, professional focus settle over me. I was an agent moving into a hostile, unknown environment. I did not drive directly to the coordinates. I found a small, run-down motel in a logging town 20 miles away and established it as my forward operating base. I spent the first day in reconnaissance, studying topographical maps of the area and driving the perimeter of the vast tract of forested land where the community was located. On the second day, before dawn, I began my approach. I parked the sedan in a hidden turnoff and made my way on foot, my old training kicking in. I moved slowly, quietly through the dense, wet undergrowth, my expensive city shoes wholly inadequate for the task. I found a high ridge that overlooked the clearing, a perfect, concealed observation post. I settled in behind a fallen log, the damp earth cold beneath me, and took out my old, heavy pair of military-grade binoculars. I focused the lenses, and the clearing swam into sharp, clear view. My entire life, my conception of the counterculture was based on bureau files, on surveillance photographs of chaos, of dirt and disorder, of lazy, unproductive idealists. I expected to see that. I expected to see a ramshackle collection of tents and huts, a place of neglected gardens and idle people. What I saw instead was a place of profound and meticulous order. It was a small, self-sufficient village. There were a handful of simple but well-constructed wooden cabins, a large communal kitchen building with smoke curling from its chimney, and a vast, thriving vegetable garden laid out in neat, geometric rows. A series of solar panels glinted in the morning sun, and a small spinning wind turbine stood on a nearby hill. It was not the order of clipped hedges and paved driveways, but it was an order nonetheless. A complex, symbiotic system, a community built with purpose and intent. And then I saw him. Michael. He was not the sullen, angry teenager I held in my memory, nor the drifting, aimless failure I had constructed in my mind. He was a man in his late 40s, his face weathered by the sun, his body lean and strong from years of physical labor. He moved with a sense of calm, unhurried authority. I watched him for hours, a silent, invisible witness to a life I had never known. I saw him in the garden, patiently showing a small group of children how to stake tomato plants. I saw him on the roof of the main building, expertly repairing a loose section of metal roofing, his movements economical and sure. I saw him later in the afternoon, sitting in a circle with a group of other adults, mediating a dispute, his hands gesturing not with anger, but with a quiet, considered reason. He was a teacher. He was a builder. He was a leader. The reversal, the moment the entire foundation of my 45-year-old prejudice shattered, came late in the day. A young child, running too fast down a path, tripped and fell hard, her cry of pain sharp in the quiet air. Michael was the first to reach her. I watched through my binoculars as he knelt beside her. I expected him to be clumsy, to be dismissive. Instead, I saw him gently examine her scraped knee. I saw him speak to her, his expression one of pure, unadulterated compassion. He calmed her tears with a gentle touch, and then, with a surprising tenderness, he lifted her into his arms and carried her towards one of the cabins. And in that simple human act, I saw not my son, the failure. I saw Julian, the hero from Eleanor's diaries. I saw the gentle, charismatic leader she had described, the man who cared for his people, the man who protected the vulnerable. I saw, with a clarity that was like a physical blow, that Michael was not a rejection of his lineage. He was its perfect, living continuation. I lowered the binoculars, my hands trembling. The carefully constructed narrative of my life, the story of my principled stand against my wayward son, had just been revealed as a pathetic, self-serving lie. The man I had disowned for betraying my values was a man who lived by a code of his own, a code of community, of compassion, of hard, honest work. His principles were just as strong as mine. They were simply different. The anger and resentment I had harbored for him for 3 decades, the fuel that had powered so much of my life, evaporated in an instant, leaving behind a vast, cold, and empty space. He was not a failure. He was, in his own world, a great success. And I, in my blindness, had been the one who had failed him. I sat there on that cold, damp ridge until the sun had set, and the clearing below was filled with the warm, yellow light of lanterns. I was a stranger, looking down on a world I could never be a part of, a world that my son, the son of another man, had built for himself. The mission was over. The truth had been found, and it was more devastating than any lie I could have ever imagined. I drove away from the ridge overlooking the small community in Oregon, my hands unsteady on the wheel, my world completely unmoored. The image of Michael, the son I had disowned, was burned into my mind. I saw him not as the sullen, rebellious failure I had carried in my memory for decades, but as a man of substance and principle, a quiet leader, a builder of a world. The discovery had not answered my questions. It had only created a deeper, more profound mystery. The lie of my life was not that my son was a failure. The lie was that I had ever understood him at all. I did not drive back to the motel. I drove until I found a quiet, secluded spot on a logging road overlooking the Pacific Ocean, its vast gray expanse a mirror of the emptiness I felt inside. I switched off the engine. The only sound was the wind and the distant crash of the surf. I needed to understand the bridge, the connection between the passionate, radical girl in the early diaries and the quiet, supportive woman who had become an FBI agent's wife. I reached into my briefcase and took out the last of the journals, the one whose cover was dated 1970. I opened the book. The handwriting was the same, but the spirit behind it was different. The fiery, confident loops of her earlier entries were gone, replaced by a more subdued, almost brittle script. The idealism had been replaced by a quiet, gnawing fear. The diary was no longer a chronicle of a revolution. It was the record of a survivor. She wrote of the aftermath of the protest, of the trials, of the way the movement had fractured under the immense pressure of government infiltration and prosecution. Her friends were scattered, some in prison, some in hiding, some simply broken, their hope for a new world extinguished. And she wrote of him. She wrote of Julian. Her entries detailed her weekly, soul-crushing pilgrimages to the federal prison where he was being held. Through her words, I saw the scene with a terrible clarity. I saw the stark, gray visiting room, the thick, smeary glass that separated them, the crackling intercom through which they spoke. I saw his face, no longer the fiery, charismatic leader, but a pale, gaunt man, his eyes holding a look of weary, caged intelligence. She wrote of the sheer, soul-crushing injustice of his trial, of the fabricated evidence and the perjured testimony of government informants. He was not a criminal. He was a political prisoner, a man silenced for the crime of his convictions, my convictions. The system I had served, the justice I had believed in, had been the instrument of his destruction. And then I read of their last visit. She was several months pregnant then, her condition a visible, undeniable fact. She wrote that Julian had looked at her, his eyes full of a love and a sadness so profound, it had nearly broken her right there in the visiting room. And through the crackling intercom, he had ended their life together. He had told her to stop visiting. He told her that he was a ghost now, and that she could not build a life chained to a ghost. He told her to find someone good, someone stable. He made her promise that she would raise their son far away from the struggle, far away from the surveillance and the informants and the violence. He was setting her free, a final terrible act of love. He was sacrificing his own fatherhood to ensure the safety of his child. The man I had considered my enemy, my rival, was a man of a deeper, more painful honor than I had ever known. The entries that followed were a landscape of pure, unadulterated grief. She was utterly alone, pregnant, and adrift, the man she loved gone, the movement she believed in shattered. It was in this state of profound loss and vulnerability that I entered her story. She wrote of our meeting at a dinner party hosted by a mutual acquaintance. She described me, a young, serious, and, in her words, deeply honorable FBI agent. I read her clinical, dispassionate assessment of my character, and I felt a chill spread through me. There was no romance in her words, no spark of connection. She described me as a biologist might describe a specimen. I was stable. I was predictable. I was kind, in a quiet, reserved way. I was, she wrote, everything that Julian was not. And that, I came to understand, was precisely why she had chosen me. Her logic, as she laid it out on the page, was both brilliant and monstrously cruel. She could not protect Julian's son as Eleanor, the known associate of a convicted radical. The world I inhabited would see the boy as a threat, a legacy to be monitored and contained. But as the wife of a federal agent, as the mother of my son, she could build the perfect cover. She could raise Julian's child in the very heart of the system that had destroyed him. She could wrap him in the protection of my name, my career, my unimpeachable patriotism. My life, my honor, my entire identity was to be the camouflage for her son's survival. It was not a marriage of love. It was a strategic alliance, an act of deep-cover espionage conducted over the course of a lifetime. The final entry in the book was written the night before our wedding. It was not addressed to the diary. It was a letter, a final, heartbreaking farewell to Julian. She told him of her choice. She told him about me, the good, steady man who would be the boy's father in name. She promised him that she was not betraying their love, but honoring it in the only way she could. She promised that she would raise their son, our Michael, to have his father's courage, his father's compassion, his father's unwavering belief in justice, even if she had to do it in secret, in a language of quiet actions and unspoken truths, right under the nose of her FBI husband. She was not joining the enemy. She was infiltrating it. I closed the diary. The sun had long since set, and my car was filled with the deep, impenetrable darkness of the Oregon forest. The full, complete, and devastating truth was now mine. My marriage had been an elaborate, 45-year-long protection detail for the son of a political prisoner. My wife had been the most dedicated, brilliant, and committed deep-cover agent I had ever known. The sense of betrayal was so immense, so total, that it was almost sublime. It was a lie of such magnificent, tragic scope that it defied simple anger. It was, in its own terrible way, the story of a great and enduring love. It just wasn't mine. I started the engine of the car. My investigation was over. I now knew everything. And I had never, in my entire life, felt more completely and utterly alone. The engine of the rental car was a low, steady hum in the vast silence of the Oregon night. I had been driving for hours, with no destination, the headlights cutting a small, lonely tunnel through the monolithic darkness of the forest. The diaries lay on the passenger seat beside me, a silent, reproachful weight. I had the truth. I had the complete, unredacted file on the great deception that had been my life. The investigation was over. The logical professional course of action was clear. Return to the airport, fly home to Virginia, and file this entire ugly history away in the deepest, most secure vault of my mind. It was a closed case. To do so would be to restore order, to re-establish the rigid, predictable discipline that had governed my existence for nearly 80 years. It was the safe, sensible path. It was the path of a coward. I pulled the car over onto a gravel shoulder overlooking a dark, silent valley. I cut the engine, and the silence that rushed in was absolute. For my entire career, I had been a man who dealt in endings. I interrogated suspects. I gathered evidence. I wrote my reports, and I closed the file. The pursuit of truth was a procedural matter, a sequence of steps that led to a definitive, legal conclusion. But this truth was different. It was not a tidy summary of a crime that could be filed and forgotten. It was a living, breathing thing. It had a face and a name. It was living a quiet, principled life in a clearing in the woods a few miles behind me. The truth was, Michael. To walk away now, to return to my empty, orderly house and pretend this knowledge did not exist, would be the most profound betrayal of all. It would be a betrayal not of Eleanor, but of the very principle of truth I had claimed to serve. I would be choosing a comfortable lie over a difficult, messy reality. I would be no better than she was. I spent the night in the car. Sleep an impossibility. My mind was a courtroom, the agent and the man presenting their closing arguments. The agent spoke of risk, of the danger of confronting a past that was not mine, of the futility of engaging with a man who was, by every legal and biological definition, a stranger. He spoke of the peace of a quiet, solitary retirement, of the simple dignity of letting the past remain buried. The man, a new and uncertain voice inside me, spoke of other things. He spoke of the look of profound, self-sacrificing love in Julian's eyes as described by Eleanor. He spoke of Eleanor's quiet, lifelong courage, the immense strength it must have taken to live her lie so perfectly for so long. And he spoke of Michael, the man I had seen through my binoculars, a man of quiet authority and gentle compassion. This new voice argued that the file was not closed, that the truth was not an abstract concept, but a human one, and that my investigation would not be complete until I had faced it. As dawn broke, casting a pale gray light over the misty valley, a decision had been made. The agent had lost his case. The risk of living with a partial, unacknowledged truth was greater than the risk of any confrontation. I had spent my life as an observer, a man who stood on the outside of other people's lives, judging and analyzing. For the first time, I had to step inside. I had to become a participant in the messy, unpredictable story I had uncovered. My plan, which had been a complex web of investigation and surveillance, now simplified into a single, terrifying objective. I had to walk down into that valley, into that clearing, and face my wife's son. I drove back to the small logging town and checked into the motel. I showered, shaved, and dressed not in the guise of a historian, but in my own clothes. I was no longer playing a role. I ate a simple breakfast at a local diner, the food tasteless in my mouth. My every action felt deliberate, momentous, the slow, heavy movements of a man walking to his own execution. There was no plan for what I would do, what I would say. For the first time in my life, I was operating without a protocol, without a script. I was armed with nothing but the diaries in my briefcase and the full, terrible weight of the truth. I drove back to the turnoff near the community and parked my car. I got out and stood for a moment at the edge of the forest, the tall firs a dark, silent wall. I could hear the distant sounds of the community, the faint ring of a hammer on metal, the murmur of voices. I took the diaries from my briefcase but left the case itself in the car. I would not come to him as an investigator with a file. I would come as a man with a story. I started walking down the narrow, muddy path into the woods. The journey was a descent, a slow shedding of my old world. With each step, the familiar certainties of my life in Virginia seemed to recede, replaced by the damp, earthy smell of the forest and the profound, unnerving quiet of this new territory. I felt a vulnerability I had not experienced since I was a young recruit at Quantico, a feeling of being utterly, completely out of my depth. After a 20-minute walk, I saw a break in the trees. I had reached the edge of the clearing. I could see the cabins, the garden, the people moving about their daily tasks. It was a world complete unto itself, a world that had existed for decades, entirely unknown to me. I stood there for a long time, a ghost at the edge of a life I had unknowingly helped to create. Taking a final deep breath, I stepped out of the cover of the trees and into the open. A few people looked up from their work, their expressions curious, but not hostile. I was an intruder, an old man in city clothes, an anomaly in their quiet world. And then, across the clearing, a man looked up from a conversation he was having. It was Michael. Our eyes met. The distance between us was 100 yards, but it felt like a universe. I saw the look of recognition on his face, followed by a wave of confusion, and then a hardening, the swift raising of a defensive wall built over a lifetime of resentment. He knew who I was. I stopped walking. I simply stood there, in the center of his world, the diaries held in my hand, a messenger from a past he had never known, waiting for him to make the next move. The 100 yards of open ground that separated us was the longest distance I had ever known. It was a silent, charged space, a vacuum containing 45 years of unspoken history, of resentment, of a lie that had shaped both our lives in ways neither of us had ever understood. The quiet, industrious sounds of the community faded into a background hum. The people, his people, stopped their work, their faces turning towards us, sensing the arrival of a moment that was private, yet monumental. They were the silent witnesses to a reckoning. I stood my ground, the worn leather diaries held in my hand, my heart a slow, heavy drum in my chest. I had come this far. The final move was his. He began to walk towards me. His movements were not aggressive, but measured, wary, the cautious advance of a man entering a minefield. His face, which I had only ever seen contorted with the sullen anger of youth, or more recently, the calm authority of a leader, was now a mask of profound, unreadable confusion. The anger was still there, a deep old ember glowing in his eyes, but it was now overlaid with a question, a vast and troubling uncertainty. He was trying to process an impossible piece of data, the presence of his sworn enemy, the rigid, unbending patriarch who had cast him out, standing peacefully in the center of the sanctuary he had built to escape him. He stopped a few feet in front of me. We stood in silence, two strangers bound by the ghost of a woman we had both loved, and both, in our own ways, never truly known. I could see the lines of age around his eyes, the gray in his hair, and I realized with a sudden, painful clarity that I was not looking at a boy, but at a man with a life, a history, a world of his own. The image of the rebellious, misguided teenager I had held onto for so long finally, completely, dissolved. I was facing an equal. The confrontation I had braced myself for, the angry accusations I had expected, never came. He simply waited, his gaze hard, his body tensed for a blow. My actions, when I finally took them, were simple. There were no words that could bridge the chasm between us. Words from me had only ever been instruments of judgment and condemnation. To speak now would be to invite the same tired battle of ideologies that had defined our broken relationship. I had come here not to argue, but to deliver evidence. I held out the first of the diaries, the one from 1968. I offered it to him not as a weapon, but as a testament, a piece of his own history he had been denied. It was an act of complete and total surrender. I was relinquishing my control of the narrative, my role as the arbiter of our family's truth. I was giving him the source code of his own life. He flinched, his eyes dropping to the old worn book in my hand. He looked at it with a deep, primal suspicion, as if it were a trick, a final cruel piece of psychological warfare from the old FBI agent. He did not take it. He looked back up at my face, searching for the trap. He found none. My face, I am sure, held no anger, no triumph, only the vast, weary sadness of a man who had carried a secret for too long. My hand remained steady, offering the book. After a long, silent moment, his own hand slowly rose. He hesitated, then his fingers brushed against mine as he took the diary from me. The brief, unexpected touch was the first time we had made physical contact in more than a decade. He looked down at the cover, at the faded gold embossing of the year. He opened it. His eyes fell upon the first page, upon the elegant, familiar handwriting of the mother he had lost. I watched his face as he began to read. I did not need to see the words. I knew them by heart. I knew he was reading of her arrival in Berkeley, of the electric sense of hope and rebellion in the air. I knew he was reading of her meeting his father, Julian, of the instant, profound connection she had felt. I watched as the first wall of his defense began to crumble. This was not the mother he knew. This was a passionate, poetic, fiercely intelligent young woman he was meeting for the very first time. His eyes scanned the page, his expression shifting from suspicion to a deep, furrowed confusion. And then I saw the exact moment he reached the critical sentence, the one that described the new life taking root inside of her, the hope that this child would carry his father's spirit, the one that named him Michael. The color drained from his face. A look of such profound, shattering disbelief washed over him that he took an involuntary step back, as if struck by a physical blow. He looked up from the diary, his eyes wild, and stared at me. The old familiar anger was gone, replaced by a raw, gaping wound of a question. He was no longer looking at his adversary. He was looking at the sole witness to the complete and total demolition of his own identity. The man he had hated his entire life was the one who had just handed him the devastating, liberating truth of his own origin. I did not offer an explanation. I simply stood there, a silent, steady presence in the storm of his unraveling. The climax of my long investigation was not an explosion, but this quiet, terrible moment of revelation. He looked down at the diary again, then back at me, his mind clearly struggling to reconcile a lifetime of assumptions with the impossible words on the page. Then, clutching the diary to his chest like a shield, he turned. He did not run. He walked away, slowly, unsteadily, like a man in a dream, moving towards the quiet solitude of his own cabin. He needed to be alone with the ghost of the woman he had just met. I watched him go. I had delivered my final report. My mission was complete. I stood alone in the center of the clearing, a stranger who had just returned a man's stolen history to him, and waited for the verdict. I did not wait for a response. After Michael had disappeared with the diary into his small wooden cabin, a profound and heavy silence settled over the clearing. The community members, who had watched our silent exchange from a respectful distance, slowly returned to their work, their glances in my direction, a mixture of pity and suspicion. I was an alien body that had been introduced into their closed system, and the effects were unknown. I had delivered the message. The primary objective of my long and painful investigation was complete. To stay now would be to wait for a verdict from a jury I had no standing with. I turned and walked back the way I had come, my footsteps heavy on the muddy path. The forest was quiet, indifferent. It had been the silent witness to the demolition of a man's life, and it kept its peace. The long drive back to Portland and the subsequent flight back to Virginia was a journey through a fog. I was an automaton, moving through the prescribed steps of modern travel without any conscious thought. I presented my identification. I took off my shoes for the security scanner. I sat and stared out the airplane window at a blanket of clouds that perfectly mirrored the featureless, gray landscape of my own mind. I had spent the last several weeks with a singular, driving purpose: to uncover the truth. I had pursued it with the relentless, dispassionate focus of an agent in the field. I had succeeded. I now possessed the truth in its entirety, and the truth was a ruin. It was a vast, silent, and empty space, and I was now its sole inhabitant. I arrived back at my house late at night. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The air was cool and still, exactly as I had left it. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked, its steady, metronomic rhythm the only sound. For 45 years, this house had been my sanctuary, my fortress of order and certainty, the place where the chaotic, dirty world I policed could not enter. Now, it was a crime scene, and I was the only detective left to walk through it. I did not turn on many lights. I moved through the shadowy rooms like a ghost, a stranger in my own museum. I started in the living room. On the center of the mantelpiece was the large, silver-framed photograph from our wedding. I stood before it for a long time. I saw us, two young, serious people, staring out at a future I had believed to be a shared one. But now I saw it differently. I saw a young, brilliant, and profoundly grieving woman, her eyes holding a secret of such immense weight that it was a miracle it did not shatter the camera lens. And I saw myself, a confident, oblivious young man in a well-fitted suit, a pillar of the very system that had just destroyed her world. I was not her husband. I was her cover. This photograph was not a memento of our love. It was the first foundational document of her 45-year-long lie. I moved to my study, the room that had been the heart of my identity. My awards and commendations from the bureau were hung on the wall, a testament to a life of service to the truth. They seemed to mock me now. I had been a celebrated investigator, a man known for his sharp eye, for his ability to see the patterns that others missed, for his relentless pursuit of the facts. And all the while, the greatest, most complex, and most deeply personal investigation of my life was unfolding in my own home, and I had been completely, utterly blind to it. My entire professional life was a bitter, profound irony. I had been a keeper of the nation's secrets, but I had been a fool in my own home. In the kitchen, I stood by the window where Eleanor and I had so often stood together, looking out at the backyard. I remembered 1,000 quiet, domestic moments, her humming as she arranged flowers in a vase, the two of us working side by side as we prepared holiday meals. I had seen these moments as the quiet, steady bedrock of our partnership. I understood now that they had been a performance, a role she had played with a skill and an endurance that was nothing short of breathtaking. Every gentle smile, every quiet act of support, every shared moment of peace had been a part of her cover, a piece of the elaborate camouflage she had constructed to protect the son of another man. The last room I entered was our bedroom. I looked at the bed we had shared for more than 4 decades. The space where she had slept beside me, night after night, was now a cold, empty void. I wondered what she had thought of in the long, dark hours before sleep. Had she thought of me? Or had her mind traveled back in time to a passionate, idealistic boy in Berkeley, to a life of protest and possibility that she had been forced to abandon? Had she lived a secret, internal life of mourning for a ghost right beside me for all those years? The intimacy I had believed to be the cornerstone of our marriage was an illusion. I had been sleeping next to a stranger. I walked back to the living room and stood before the wedding photograph again. The anger was gone. The shock had subsided. All that was left was a sadness so vast and so deep that it felt like a geological feature. I had lost her twice, first to death, and now to the truth. I reached out and took the heavy silver frame from the mantelpiece. I did not smash it. I did not throw it away. My actions, even in the face of this emotional cataclysm, were still governed by a lifetime of procedure. I carried the photograph into my study. I opened the empty file folder that was still on my desk, the one I had labeled Eleanor Corrigan. I placed the photograph inside. It was no longer a cherished memory. It was now what it had always secretly been, a piece of evidence. I closed the folder and placed it in the center of my desk blotter. I sat down in my chair. The house was silent. The case was closed, and I was alone in the ruins. The last box was sealed. The moving truck pulled away from the curb, its diesel engine a low rumble that was the final punctuation mark on my 45 years in that house. I stood for a moment in the empty living room, the afternoon sun slanting through the bare windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The house was no longer a home, no longer a crime scene. It was just a property, a hollowed-out shell of a life, waiting for new owners to fill it with their own stories, their own secrets. I did not feel a sense of loss. I felt only a profound and quiet relief, the feeling of a man walking away from the wreckage of a long and costly war. I locked the front door for the final time and drove away, without looking back. My new life is a place of deliberate simplicity. I have a small, clean apartment in a city I have never lived in before, a city with a university and a vast, quiet library. The walls are white. The furniture is sparse and functional. There are no ghosts here. My days have a new kind of order. The rigid, defensive discipline of my old routine has been replaced by a more gentle, inquisitive one. My mornings are spent at the library, in the hushed, cathedral-like silence of the history section. I have been reading. I have been methodically working my way through the reading list Dr. Thorne, my unexpected ally, had given me. I read histories of the protest movements, biographies of their leaders, collections of their poetry. I am, for the first time, trying to understand the world that shaped the woman I married. Each book, each new perspective, is a small act of reconciliation, a quiet conversation with her ghost. The diaries, all of them, sit in a simple, acid-free archival box on a shelf in my new, small study. I have not destroyed them. They are not a source of pain anymore. They are the truth. They are the complex, contradictory, and deeply human testimony of a life lived under the immense pressure of love and fear. They are Eleanor. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I take one out. I do not read it as an investigator searching for clues or a husband searching for betrayal. I read it now as a man trying to understand a history that is inextricably his own. I read the words of the passionate, courageous young woman she was, and I feel not anger, but a deep and profound sense of wonder, and an even deeper sense of loss for the person I never allowed myself to know. A month ago, a letter arrived, forwarded from my lawyer. It was postmarked from Oregon. The envelope was plain, my name and address written in an unfamiliar, strong hand. Inside, there was no long, emotional explanation or apology. There was only a single high-quality photograph. It was a picture of a giant, ancient redwood tree, its massive trunk rising into a canopy that was lost in the sunlight. The sheer scale and age of the tree was humbling. On the back of the photograph, a few simple words were written. The handwriting was his, Michael's. It was not an apology. It was a statement of fact. It was an offering of peace. I slid the photograph into a simple, clean frame. It is the only picture that sits on my desk now. The final act of my transformation happened last week. I opened the sealed boxes that contained the remnants of my old study. I took out the framed commendations from the bureau, the glossy photographs of me with directors and politicians, the heavy bronze eagle statuette. For years, these objects had been the architecture of my identity, the proof of a life of service and honor. I looked at them now and saw them for what they were, relics from a different life, the life of a man who had valued certainty above all else. I did not throw them away. That would have been an act of anger, and I was past anger. I simply wrapped each one carefully in tissue paper and placed them back in the box. I sealed the box and moved it to a storage closet. The case was closed. The walls of my study were now bare. They did not stay that way for long. I hung the photograph of the redwood tree where my highest commendation had once been. I framed a simple, elegant map of the Berkeley campus as it was in 1968. And finally, I went through a box of old, loose photographs from the early years of my marriage. Pictures that had never made it into the official albums. I found a small, candid snapshot of Eleanor. It was taken on a beach, much like the one she described in her last letter to Julian. She was not looking at the camera. She was looking out at the ocean, a small, genuine smile on her face, the wind whipping through her hair. She looked in that moment completely and utterly free. I placed this photograph, this image of the woman she truly was, in the center of my desk. My life is quiet now. It is a life of reading, of reflection, of a peace that is built not on certainty, but on the acceptance of complexity. I have lost the simple, orderly narrative of my past. I have lost the son I thought was mine, and the wife I thought I knew. But in their place, I have found a more difficult and ultimately more honest truth. My freedom is not happiness. It is not joy. It is the freedom from the prison of a perfect, simple lie. It is the quiet, daily work of understanding the messy, contradictory, and beautiful soul of the woman I loved. I sit in my study, her diary open on my desk, her true smile looking up at me from the photograph, and I read. And for the first time, I am beginning to understand.